That night, Pedro was still sitting in the same room. Time seemed to have lost its usual linearity. It wasn't possible to say precisely how much time had passed since it all began. Minutes and hours seemed dissolved into a continuous experience that no longer followed the normal rhythm of things. The atmosphere remained simple, almost too ordinary for what was happening inside. There was a wooden table in the center, some chairs out of alignment, and personal belongings scattered without clear organization. But none of that drew attention. What dominated the space was not the physical, but a kind of invisible tension, as if the very air were laden with meaning. People were still trying to process what they had experienced. There was no consensus on how to interpret it. Some tried to explain it with familiar religious words. Others simply gave up trying to explain and remained silent. There were also those who tried to rationalize, as if a logical explanation could restore stability to the experience. But none of these approaches seemed sufficient. It was as if everyone there had been confronted with something that transcended their usual mental categories. It wasn't just a spiritual event. It was a reorganization of how reality was perceived. Pedro observed all of this without trying to intervene. He felt a mixture of clarity and unease. Clarity because something within him seemed to recognize what was happening as part of a larger historical continuity. Uncomfort because he also realized that any attempt to reduce it to simple explanations would be insufficient. Outside, the city was still reeling. The news spread quickly, but there was no single version of what had happened. Each group interpreted it differently. Some spoke of spiritual phenomena, others of mass hysteria, still others of something inexplicable that didn't fit into known categories. This multiplicity of interpretations was, in itself, a sign that something out of the ordinary had happened. But the most important point was not the event itself. It was what it revealed about how people understand spirituality. Throughout religious history, there has always been a tendency to organize spiritual experiences into fixed categories. This aids in communication, the transmission of knowledge, and the construction of theological systems. But it can also create limitations. When a concept becomes too fixed, it ceases to be explored in its original depth. That is how, over time, expressions such as spiritual gifts and fruits of the Spirit came to be understood in an increasingly simplified way. Gifts came to be seen as extraordinary manifestations, almost like supernatural abilities granted to certain specific individuals. Something like a higher, spiritual level. Fruits, on the other hand, came to be seen as desirable moral virtues, almost as traits of a spiritually refined personality. This separation, while functional in some pedagogical contexts, creates a division that does not necessarily exist in this way in the original text. To understand this, we need to go back to the structure of biblical thought. In Hebrew and Greco-Roman thought of the period, there was no rigid separation between inner and outer as independent categories. Life was understood as an integrated flow between action, character, community, and relationship with the divine. When early Christianity began to formulate its theological language, it was not creating concepts from scratch. It was reinterpreting previous traditions within new experiences. And this creates tension. The word used for gift in Greek texts is linked to the idea of grace. This means that the central point is not human ability, but divine initiative. A gift is not something one acquires. It is something one receives. This already dismantles a very common logic, the idea that spiritual gifts are signs of maturity or spiritual reward. If that were the case, talent would be proportional to effort. But the logic of grace works differently. She doesn't follow merit. She follows the concession. This means that two people can receive different manifestations without this implying spiritual superiority or inferiority. The focus is not on comparison, but on function. On the other hand, the concept of fruit is completely different. The fruit doesn't appear immediately. It's not inserted from the outside. It develops from the inside out. And this depends on an ongoing process. The growth of a fruit depends on a constant connection with a source of life. Without this connection, there is no development. The agricultural metaphor used in the texts is not merely illustrative. It is structural to the thought process. A tree doesn't produce fruit through conscious effort. It produces fruit because it is alive and connected. This completely shifts the idea of spiritual production. The fruit is not something manufactured. It is something that emerges. This difference between gift and fruit already establishes two different logics. The gift is linked to immediate receipt. The fruit is linked to continuous development. The gift points to granted action, the result points to procedural transformation. The gift is functional, the fruit is formative at this point. Jesus' narrative about the vine takes on central importance. When he speaks of branches and vines, he is not merely describing an abstract spiritual metaphor. He is describing a logic of continuous dependence. The sector lacks productive autonomy. It depends on the vine. If it disconnects, it no longer produces fruit. This means that the central question is not what the branch does, but where the branch remains. And this completely changes the way we think about spirituality. Instead of a performance-based logic, a permanence-based logic emerges. To remain is a profound idea. It doesn't just mean being physically present. It means maintaining a connection over time. It signifies relational continuity. It means active dependence. And this has direct implications for how we understand spiritual behavior. Many people, throughout their religious life, try to cultivate in themselves characteristics such as love, patience, and kindness. They treat these qualities as behavioral goals, as something to be achieved through discipline. This creates a type of spirituality based on constant effort. But this effort, when disconnected from the idea of permanence, tends to generate frustration, because a person begins to measure their spiritual worth by their ability to produce internal results. And this often generates a cycle of blame and attempts at continuous improvement. The biblical text suggests a different approach. Instead of trying to directly produce these qualities, the focus is on maintaining the connection that allows them to emerge. When that connection is alive, the fruit appears as a consequence. When it's not there, the effort becomes artificial. And here the narrative begins to delve into Paul's theology. From this point on, Paul's reflection becomes even clearer when we observe the context of his letters, especially Galatians and 1 Corinthians. He is not writing abstract concepts to construct a closed theological system. He is responding to concrete problems within real communities, full of tension, conflict, and divergent interpretations of what it means to live a life guided by the Spirit. In Galatians, for example, Paul is dealing with an intense dispute about spiritual identity. Some groups were arguing that belonging to God's people required specific external signs, linked to the tradition of the law. Others had already experienced a greater openness, understanding that something new was happening in the way God related to people. This clash of perspectives creates an atmosphere of confusion, and it is in this scenario that Paul introduces the idea of the fruit of the Spirit. But what he's doing there isn't just listing desirable virtues. He's presenting a criterion for evidence of inner transformation. In other words, he is saying that there is a type of life that does not depend solely on external rules, but on a continuous internal change that manifests itself observably in behavior, relationships, and attitude towards life. When he speaks of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, he is not suggesting that each person should strive separately to achieve each of these things as isolated goals. The very use of the word fruit in the singular already points in another direction. They are not several independent fruits. It is a single reality with multiple expressions. This idea can be better understood if we imagine a living organism. A healthy body does not produce different, separate states of health for each part. Health is a general condition that manifests itself in different functions at the same time. The heart does not have one state of health, the lungs another, and the brain yet another. There is a single state of vitality that is expressed throughout the entire system. Similarly, the fruit of the Spirit is described as a single reality that manifests itself in different dimensions of human life. Love appears as the structural basis of this reality. It is not merely a feeling, but an inner direction in life. It is a fundamental disposition to seek the good of others. In this context, joy does not depend on external circumstances, but on an inner stability that is not easily shaken by temporary situations. Peace ceases to be merely the absence of conflict and becomes a form of inner integration, a coherence between what one believes and how one lives. Patience is not merely passive tolerance, but the ability to sustain processes without disrupting the continuity of the relationship. Kindness and faithfulness appear as practical expressions of this same reality, demonstrating that what is internal inevitably becomes external. And self-control closes this structure like a kind of internal organization that prevents immediate impulses from destroying the coherence of the whole. But none of this works in isolation. The central point is that all of this emerges from a single source, the continuous connection with the Spirit. This is where the metaphor of the vine in John 15 becomes extremely relevant to this understanding. When Jesus says that he is the vine and the disciples are the branches, he is establishing a logic of vital dependence. The branch does not have an independent life. It does not produce fruit by itself. It can only produce fruit while it remains connected, and the verb used there, to remain, does not indicate a specific action, but a continuous state of existence. This means that spiritual life, within this framework, is not a sequence of individual achievements, but a relationship sustained over time. This idea profoundly changes how we understand spiritual growth. In many religious contexts, there is a tendency to transform spiritual life into a kind of scale of progress. People begin to evaluate themselves based on how much they have evolved in certain virtues. This can lead to a form of spirituality centered on personal performance. But the logic of the biblical text points in another direction. Instead of focusing on the direct production of virtues, the focus is on the quality of the connection. If the connection is alive, the fruit will appear. If the connection is weak, the result doesn't appear naturally, and the effort tends to become artificial. This shift in focus is extremely important because it alters the central question of spiritual life. The question is no longer, "What am I producing?" and it becomes, "Where am I staying?" This change, though simple in form, is profound in its implications. Now, when we look at spiritual gifts, especially in 1 Corinthians 12, we see another dimension of that same logic. Paul describes a variety of manifestations: wisdom, knowledge, faith, healings, miracles, prophecy, discernment, tongues, and interpretation of tongues. But he is not presenting this as a spiritual ranking or as a status system. The context of Corinth is essential to understanding this. Corinth was a cosmopolitan city, marked by cultural diversity, intense commercial activity, and a strong presence of social competition. This dynamic ended up being reflected within the local Christian community. Some members began to value certain spiritual manifestations as signs of superiority. In other words, gifts began to be used as criteria for spiritual status. And that is precisely what Paul confronts. He begins by reorganizing the understanding of the origin of spiritual gifts. He states that there are different manifestations, but the same Spirit; different services, but the same Lord; different actions, but the same God. This Trinitarian structure is not merely a theological formulation. It has a practical function: to dismantle any idea of spiritual hierarchy based on visible manifestations. Next, Paul introduces a fundamental principle: gifts are given for the common good. This means that their role is not individual, but collective. A gift is not private property. It is a functional resource for the body. And here appears one of the most powerful images in the entire letter: the human body. Paul describes the body as an integrated system where each part has a specific function, but no part exists independently. The eye cannot do without the hand. The foot cannot disregard the head. Each part depends on the other. And even more importantly, when one part suffers, all suffer. When one part rejoices, all rejoice. This destroys any logic of spiritual superiority based on visibility or function. And here a fundamental reversal appears: that which seems weakest may be most necessary. That which seems most invisible may be most essential. This means that the value of the gifts lies not in their appearance, but in their function within the body. And this brings them, in a way, closer to the logic of fruits. Because neither of them exists for individual display. They exist for a greater dynamic. But there is an important difference. Gifts are distributed in a functional and immediate way, while fruits are formed in a continuous and relational way. This distinction helps to understand why Paul later places love at the center of everything in 1 Corinthians 13. This chapter is not a poetic interlude between two technical blocks. He is the interpretative core of the entire discussion. Paul states that even if someone has extraordinary gifts, if they do not have love, none of that has real value. This does not mean that gifts cease to exist. This means they lose their purpose when disconnected from the relational reality that should sustain them. Without love, gifts become mere noise. In other words, they continue to produce an external effect, but lose their internal meaning. This creates a difference between performance and reality, between appearance and essence, between activity and life. And this is where the central tension between gifts and fruits is resolved. They are not opposites, but they're not the same thing either. They operate on different levels of the same spiritual reality. Gifts refer to what the Spirit does through people for the benefit of others. The fruits refer to what the Spirit forms within people as a continuous transformation of being. One is action-oriented. The other one is for training. One is external. The other inmate. One is functional. The other is structural. But both depend on the same source. And this source is not a system of rules or a spiritual technique. It is an ongoing relationship of permanence. Now, when this perspective is applied to human experience, especially the experience of spiritual crisis, it gains even greater depth. Many people go through periods when they are unable to identify either positive fruits or gifts in their own lives. This can lead to feelings of spiritual emptiness, inadequacy, or even abandonment. But within the logic presented by the biblical texts, this perception is not necessarily a diagnosis of a lack of connection. In many cases, it can be part of the maturation process itself, because spiritual life is not linear. It includes phases of clarity and phases of silence, visible production phases and invisible phases, phases of activity and phases of silent formation. The Christian contemplative tradition calls these periods of spiritual aridity the dark night, not as an absence of God, but as a transformation in the way we perceive His presence. This reinforces the idea that the focus is not on the visibility of the results, but on the continuity of the connection. In the end, what emerges from all this reflection is a more integrated understanding of spiritual life. Gifts and fruits are not competing categories. They are complementary dimensions. One expresses the movement of the Spirit through the person. The other expresses the movement of the Spirit within the person. And both point to the same central reality. Spiritual life is not an individual achievement, but a continuous participation in something greater than the individual. It's not about accumulating signs of spirituality. It's about staying connected to the source that makes any signal possible.